I don't want to wait around till I finally have some sort of illness that I can use as an excuse for what I wanted to do anyway. I would just like to go while I'm in good health and feeling completed. I just feel complete.
The Completed Life Initiative presents Voices of the Completed Life. In each episode, we share unprecedented conversations at the heart of the human experience. Our hosts dive into honest dialogue about mortality, loss, and grief, as we hear firsthand from individuals who seek to avoid life-limiting maladies in a body that may no longer serve them, and who instead aim to celebrate their lives as completed. These are stories that may challenge and surprise you. These stories are worth listening to. These are Voices of the Completed Life. We want you to be aware that the contents of this podcast include mention of death, dying, and suicide. This podcast is meant for informational purposes only. This podcast content is not intended to substitute for professional advice, diagnosis, or treatment. If you or a loved one are in crisis or emotional distress, please seek out the help of a mental health practitioner or call 988 for the National Suicide and Crisis Lifeline. Veterans can call 988 and press 1. You can also visit 988lifeline.org/chat. Agents are available 24 hours a day and can communicate in English and Spanish. If you are outside of the United States of America, you should call your local emergency line. Our host for this episode, Sarah Kiskaden-Bechtel, MBE, is the inaugural program director of the Completed Life Initiative. Ms. Kiskaden-Bechtel is an innovative and strategic problem solver with over a decade of experience in bioethics. She has devoted her career to untangling oft misunderstood and oft stigmatized issues at the heart of human experience. In this episode of Voices of the Completed Life, we interviewed Fred Philippi. Fred reached out to the Completed Life Initiative to share his own story. He does not have a terminal diagnosis, chronic aches and pains, or any other notable physical or medical conditions. He has lived a meaningful life, done everything he wanted to do, said everything he wanted to say, and said goodbye to the people he loves. Fred's vision for his completed life has been met. It is a vision informed by a lifetime of religious and spiritual study, a successful professional career, a 20-year marriage, and his recent volunteer work in the area of medical aid in dying education. While under current laws in the United States, there's nothing Fred can do to complete his life on his own. His perspective on what such laws would mean for himself and others is one worth sharing. We now turn to Sarah Kiskaden-Bechtel's conversation with Fred Philippi.
How are you feeling today?
Very good. I'm 80 years old and I have no significant physical aches or pains. I just feel I've completed my life.
Wow, that's a profound statement, and it's a beautiful statement. I'm so curious to learn about how you got to that point.
I'm here like when I have no significant aches or pains. I'm kind of wishing I had an excuse like, oh, if I only had a fatal illness, so I could ask for medical aid in dying. I'm in that place where I would like to go now. I would like to say this party of life has been really wonderful. All in all, it was worth it. And I hope I've contributed some things, but I'm kind of ready to go. I'm tired and I would like to go. I would just like to fall asleep and not wake up and go. Here in California, I work with Compassion and Choices. I've been a volunteer with them for 3 years. They advocate medical aid in dying. And I give talks at a local senior center, especially is one of the main places on medical aid in dying under California law. But the state in the United States, we have the most conservative medical aid in dying laws of any country that has these laws. And here you have to basically have been given a prognosis of 6 months or less to live before you can even ask for medical aid in dying. And most doctors, even in a state that has this law, most doctors either know nothing about it, are horrified by it, or will tell you, well, I don't have any training in it, so I'm empathetic, but I can't really do anything. So one of the efforts, there's another organization in California who's bringing doctors up to speed with it, because the doctors are no more advanced on this subject than we who might wish for it are.
I'm curious, how did you get involved with volunteering with Compassionate Choices?
Once I retired, I looked around for a year for some organization to volunteer with. And I wanted to be passionate about it. I didn't want to just kill time. And after about a year, I finally found Compassionate Choices. And it was what I kind of was passionate to do at this existential moment in my life.
When we first had a conversation, you mentioned that you're ready to go, that you've lived a completed life.
Yes, I'm 80. I've completed everything. It's like it's a natural time. It's not traumatic for me. I wish there was something we could do. Can we bring a lawsuit that, for some sort of right? It'd be nice if we could.
Well, I've heard from other people the same sentiment. And so let's backtrack just one step. May I ask, why is now your time? Why is your life completed at this point in time?
I don't have much else on my plate. I have been everything I wanted to be. I've been a monk. I've been a married guy. I've been a somewhat merry widow with my architecture after Barry's death. And now things are winding down, though. When I did my architectural design, I financed my own projects and then sold them. Sometimes I made money, sometimes I didn't, but I had a lot of fun. I'm at the point now where I can't do that anymore. I can't afford to do that anymore. And so I'm volunteering, but I feel like I've completed my life. I don't have anything big left on the plate to do.
Do you have any criteria for when your life no longer serves you? It sounds like you've checked off all of your life goals. Are there any other additional criteria perhaps for what your vision of your completed life is?
I don't think so. My income pretty much balances my outcome, so I can keep going. But I don't want to wait around till I finally have some sort of illness that I can use as an excuse for what I wanted to do anyway. I would just like to go while I'm in good health and feeling completed. I just feel complete.
Often, guests on the podcast, Voices of the Completed Life podcast, will often have had a confrontation with mortality in some regard, whether it's with a loved one, a family member, a close friend, or perhaps, a scare themselves with a particular illness. In your lifetime, have you experienced death? And if so, in what way?
Yes, my mother's death in 1989. She had her last 3 years. She was quite sick. And at that time, 1989, I was like 2 years into my marriage. All I knew at that time was you just keep fighting for life. My mom would say to me sometimes, they shoot horses for less than what I had. She was thinking ahead of me. My mother was always very progressive, and I was, ironically, she had no religion when we were growing up. My father had no religion, and I go trotting off to the seminary. Yeah, go figure, at 13. So in 1989, when she was 73, she died in a hospital with intubated. After she died, one of the nurses said, we haven't been able to give her pain medication for the last couple of days. As I look back at the time, I didn't think a lot about it. I just thought, well, we just keep working for life until, nature just takes her. Now I look back at it as, oh God, that was just so barbaric. She would have, we didn't, in 1989, even hospice was not that well known yet. At least I didn't know of it very much. So we never considered hospice for her. The last couple of weeks of her life, I went out looking at old age homes, they were like awful. You go up, drive up, and there's a big porch, and there's 12 people in rocking chairs, each one looking out into space. Oh, it was awful. I think she just wanted to die because there was no other option when she died. It was protracted, it was in agony, and I do what I do now as a kind of reparation. If I can possibly do anything to make up for those days of ignorance, I do what I can now.
So I'm sorry to hear that your mother suffered at the end. Was it caused by cancer or something else?
It was a combination of things. She had broken a hip and it wasn't healing well. I think she did have a cancer of some sort. It's not quite clear to me. I think it was a cancer of the blood. But see, I was living in New York. She was still in Philadelphia with my sister. And my sister was managing her health more than I was. I don't know. I just wasn't able to grasp mortality and being close to it. I was kind of working out my own stuff.
In addition to your late mother, you also mentioned your late husband, Barry. If I may, I wanted to ask, what was Barry like? And how would you characterize his death?
Well, Barry was diagnosed with schizophrenia when he was around 20 years old. And he spent the greater part of his 20s in and out of mental institutions as they figured out just what it was that he actually had and what medications would work for him and in what dosages. We met when he was 30 years old and he had begun to kind of get things together. He was working at one of the financial companies down in the Wall Street area as a secretary and filling in on the desk, as they called it, where analysts or somebody responds to investors who make a call in. He would be there on the desk as a fill-in when we met. He eventually got promoted to be full-time on desk at another another financial firm. And then he rose through some ranks. He finally became a financial analyst and a director of the company by 2007, 2008. So I like to think that while we were married, for the first 10 years, I was the major wage earner and he was kind of piddling around in the shallow waters. And then in the second 10 years, he suddenly went roaring ahead. And I like to think that that was a good thing. Our relationship was good for him to get his feet under him and to do what he could do. Because I always saw beautiful things in him. He always told me right from the beginning that he was schizophrenic and narcissistic. You want to throw that one in too. But he was very open about both of those things. And it helps when a person is open that they know it and they work on it. In the case of schizophrenia, that he does take his medication. Because I've read somewhere that often schizophrenics don't take their medication. He was religious about taking his medication to do everything he could to be on top of the game. And things went well for many years. But when the financial crisis of 2008 hit, it knocked him off his center. Bear Stearns was to be bought out by JP Morgan Chase. And JP Morgan Chase was going to bring over some of the Bear Stearns people, but couldn't bring everybody over. And Barry got the phone call one morning, May 22nd, 2008, that he would not be brought over. He would be let go. So he came home that night. We had dinner together as usual. He prepared for bed. I walked in on him in the dressing room, and he had overdosed on his drugs. And I said, I will respect your wishes, but won't you please let me call an ambulance? And he said, no, this was his choice. He wanted to die at home. He didn't want to die being pushed around in a hospital corridor on a gurney while they're rushing and hurrying and people are screaming all around him. He wanted to die here at home on his terms. And so I said, I will respect your wishes. And then I said, well, can I stay with you? And so we lay down together. And as it sometimes happens when a person overdoses on drugs, they become ill. Suddenly he threw up on me because I was right next to him in bed. He turned and threw up on the blanket. Then he struggled to get out of bed. He wanted to try to get to the bathroom. And I jumped out of bed and I helped him to the bathroom. And we made about 6 or 8 trips ultimately to the bathroom, but we came through it. There was a point where we came out the other side of that crisis by midnight. And 3 times in the course of all that, I said to him, I will respect your wishes, but won't you please let me call an ambulance? And he constantly said no, the same answer. He wanted to die here at home. But by midnight, I thought we had come out the other side of that crisis. I thought he was falling asleep. I was planning that we would see a professional first thing in the morning. I was so exhausted at that point, so emotionally exhausted that I fell asleep next to him. And when I woke up at 4 a.m., he was not there in bed with me. And in that moment, I knew he had decided to use our 29th floor terrace as his way to say goodbye. We had a chance. We did say goodbye when we thought he was dying of the overdose. We said goodbye. We had our final words, which I thought was important. But then I thought, we passed that. We got past it. But he was determined. This was his time that he wanted to go because his career had kind of crashed. I liked to think that, you can rebuild. That had been my attitude earlier in the evening when I picked him up from work that night. Down at the New Jersey Ferry, there's a Weehawken Ferry, and we were living in Fort Lee at that time. And when I picked him up at the ferry, I thought, well, I was actually floating his resume to headhunters around the world. And 2 weeks after he died, a headhunter did call in from Hong Kong because in those years, 2000, 2009, these financial people were just going wherever the jobs were, anywhere around the world. And an offer came in from Hong Kong. We could have gone there. I was retired already. We could have gone as a couple. But that did not happen. So I respected his wishes. I did not override him in some way. And I'm happy for that. His family hated me for that. They took me through lawsuits and everything, trying to just grab everything. They tried to cannibalize the apartment that we shared because they thought everything that was his was theirs now. So I had all this heavy legal stuff hanging over me from the day he died for 2 years thereafter. We finally settled things. So that was the closest up death that I had, where I said to the person, I will respect your wishes, but would you let me? Because he was only 51 years old. It was not really time, except in his time. It was his time. Now, schizophrenics, remember, are prone to suicide. I think 10% of people who are diagnosed with schizophrenia do commit suicide. But I had hoped that we could do something more. But I was willing to I was not going to do anything to override him. I was going to respect him. So that was the death.
Thank you so much for sharing, and I'm so sorry to hear of what happened, and I just want to lift up your courage in respecting his wishes. That sounds so difficult, and thank you for trusting me with that.
Sure.
Before we continue with our conversation with Fred, we reiterate that the contents of this podcast are meant for informational purposes only. This podcast content is not intended to substitute for professional advice, diagnosis, or treatment. If you or a loved one are in crisis or emotional distress, please seek out the help of a mental health practitioner or call 988 for the National Suicide and Crisis Lifeline. Veterans can call 988 and press 1. You can also visit 988lifeline.org/chat. Agents are available 24 hours a day and can communicate in English and Spanish. If you are outside of the United States of America, you should call your local emergency line. You're listening to Voices of the Completed Life, a podcast brought to you by the Completed Life Initiative. Learn more about the Completed Life Initiative and donate to our cause at www.completedlife.org. We provide groundbreaking presentations about the right to control one's own end-of-life experience. We explore legislative options for expanding the eligibility criteria for medical aid in dying within the United States and look to other countries around the globe in support of the right to die. We empower people to ask, what does it mean to live a completed life? Spread the word about the completed life on social media by using #CompletedLife. And now, back to our episode.
In your early years, do you have a memory of a death in the family or someone in the community or an awareness of mortality?
Well, unlike Faith Summerfield, who said that from an early age, she was brought to think about death and dying and mortality. It wasn't like that with me at all. My first strongest memory is when I was around 4 or 5 years old. I knew I was gay. So that's going to put me on a track. That's going to make me do a lot of thinking, and ultimately to make my own decisions, to do thinking about things that other people might not think about. So I was always thinking out of the box from the age of 4 or 5 and being told I was sinful, sick, and illegal.
So where did you grow up?
I was born and grew up in the Philadelphia area, both in the city and in suburbs around that city, until I was 19 years old.
Where did you go from there?
I headed out to California to join a monastic community on the coast in California, an area of the coast that's called Big Sur, capital B-I-G, space capital S-U-R. It's a beautiful area where mountains come right down to the ocean. And I was a member of that community for almost 20 years.
What was it like to be part of that monastic community?
It was very contemplative oriented, as distinguished from, say, having schools or hospitals. It just stayed in community, and it occupied itself with work and prayer on a daily basis. Several times a day, chanting in the church and alternating with work and community meetings and personal time. It was a form of Catholic tradition called Benedictine, but Benedictines vary a lot from one monastery to another. Some Benedictine monasteries have colleges and universities attached to them, and the monks are the professors. Mm-hmm. Others, like where I was, were simply intentionally isolated and alone and contemplative hermits, really hermits, at least a semi-hermit life. Each monk had his own separate little hermitage that he lived in, as distinguished from living in one big monastery. And our own little garden around each cell. And the ideal was to spend most of your day in the cell, except when you would go to the church for community chanting morning, noon, evening, and night, several times a day. And the ideal was to live continuously in a kind of a union with God day and night, even now. And so there was an effort to purify the mind of distractions, just be here now in the presence of God and in the presence of each other in a way that would be in accordance with charity and compassion. We had Buddhist neighbors and we did get to know them. And so a certain amount of Buddhism rubbed off on me because I was one of those of us in our monastery who went over there and spent days with them doing the same thing in their zendo, chanting there. But I didn't know they were chanting in Japanese.
That's fascinating. And, to tie it into completed life terms, did you happen to see anyone pass away in the community at that time? How was that regarded within the community?
The community was mostly young when I was there, 20s and 30s. Only the one monk who had been the founder of the community died. And the sense was being at rest in God. I didn't think a lot about death at that time. I'm one of those people who addressed the major issue that happened to arise at the moment. So like when I was 4 or 5 years old, I was gay and I knew I'd be dealing with that. When I wanted to make a little more sense of life as an 11-year-old gay kid, I was kind of wondering, what's it all about? I'm not sure I want to be here. I decided to give God a chance and I entered the seminary, but I was dealing with existential questions as they came along. And it's only, frankly, to be honest, now, now that I'm retired at the age of 76 and now I'm 80, that I'm thinking about death and dying for myself and how I want to do it. It's the existential issue of the moment. Last moment, I guess. I wasn't really thinking about death in those days. Finally, when I was about 33, I decided to get out of the monastery. And I went out mainly just to live with the poor because we were kind of exclusive where we were. And Catholics had an attitude at that time of a preferential option for the poor. So I wanted to go into the city and just live a simple monastic life in and among the less privileged. And I also wanted the experience of earning my own living as distinguished from being benefactored by lots of generous people. And after 2 years doing that, what would you know, but the old issue of human sexuality arose again, and I had to start dealing with that.
Where were you at this point? Were you still in Big Sur or had you moved up to San Francisco?
I had asked to go out on a leave of absence and went up to San Francisco to get some work. Mm-hmm. I found that I could translate my theological degree into being a legal assistant in a large law firm. I was ashamed. I tried to be a carpenter at first, like Jesus, and I just couldn't hit a nail on the head straight. Oh, well, I'll work with attorneys and be.
Okay, that's great. So how long were you in San Francisco? I know you eventually landed in New York. That's quite a jump.
I was in San Francisco for 3 years as a legal assistant. Mm-hmm. And then I took a year off because I was getting to be mid-30s. And I was thinking a midlife year off just to reflect on everything. And after that, I then went back to Philadelphia because I had an opportunity with one other person to continue living a kind of monastic life in the city. But my parents were needing me at that point, so I lived near them, but I was a monk in Camden because, again, I chose to be with the less privileged for 4 years. But still wrestling at this point very consciously with the human sexuality issue. And after 4 years doing that, my companion, my monastic companion, said, "It's time for you to go." I got fired. So when that experience ended, I decided to go up to New York and be a legal assistant there, reactivate that in large law firms in New York City. And at that time, I decided, okay, I'm done with monasticism in a formal way, and I'm going to explore creating a relationship. Mm-hmm. And within 6 months, I met the person who would be the one. I met him in January of 1987. My Camden experience ended in 86, and New York began in 86. And in 87, I met him, and we dated for a year. And then we bought our first apartment in Forest Hills together. We actually got a certificate of domestic partnership in 1993. It did take a while. And New York City did offer that certificate beginning in 1993 when the state did not, but the city did. And I was, of course, violating everything I'd ever thought and believed about human sexuality for the first 44 years of my life. We met when I was 44, and we married when I was 45. And he had to push in a way. Again, I needed to be pushed a little bit. Yeah, I was like, well, I'm living my delayed adolescence. What's the hurry? I'm only 44.
And how long did your marital bliss last? It sounds like it was a happy marriage.
Yes, from 1988, when we moved in together and bought our first apartment, until 2008, when he died. I've never remarried. He was the one and only. To this day, every time I have a meal, for example, I use the Jewish prayer, Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, and I say, Baruch atah Buddy, also Barry. Yeah, because I'm receiving gifts from him that he left me, and it's a joyful thing. And so I always remember the Lord and Barry every meal. Mm. And so it will be. He was my one and only. He was Jewish. I was Goy, Christian. And so we sort of did both things. We celebrated the Jewish holy days and Sabbaths with his family. And then we plodded off to churches as well. He liked Trinity Church in Wall Street because he worked in the financial district. So even as a Jew, he would kind of sneak into a little side chapel and pray quietly. Initially, when he was in his 20s, he would prayer with tears because he didn't know how to deal with being gay himself. And would just pray with tears about how to handle it.
Wow.
Lo and behold, the answer to his prayers was to meet me. I met him in response to my prayers. And so after a couple of years, I began another existential thing. Having gotten my human sexuality questions resolved, I returned to what I had always loved to do as a kid, be an architectural designer. Like when I was 10 years old, I would be sitting at my desk in my bedroom doing architectural plans, designing imaginary houses and building cardboard models of those houses and doing exterior views of the houses as well as the floor plans. I love that. My father hated me for it, which is another hard thing that pushed me toward seminary because my father hated me. I was gay. Where was I to go in this world? What was I to do? I think I have to try and figure some things out. So the first thing was to leave home and go to seminary. It was a boarding school seminary. And now, lo and behold, as I'm getting close to 50 years old, I'm getting back in touch with what I kind of felt meant to do when I was 10 years old. But that was a problem for my partner. He wanted me to just keep working what I could do bring home that paycheck every 2 weeks. Don't give me this stuff. I want to be this or I want to be that. You're getting near 50. That's not going to work with me. So I had to make a choice, and I did. I chose him to stay with him. But I reserved the hope that from time to time I could continue to do some kind of architectural designs. And sure enough, after a few years, I was able to gut renovate our apartment. And then I was able to do a few other apartments after that. And then after he eventually died, we were married for 20 years until he died. Then I just went on to do what I wanted to do free without anybody complaining about it.
I'm glad you finally found your way back to it.
Yeah, but I wasn't thinking about dying at that point either.
So, in terms of the notion of the completed life, how did it come to you?
It was on the internet somewhere, maybe YouTube, I'm not sure, because I would have been looking around for end of life videos under various subheadings, and somehow I was led to completed life. It was an area of interest, but I wasn't pursuing it in an assiduous way. When I found the phrase completed life, I thought, yeah, that's what I'm feeling. We hadn't been given the liberty to really think that on other websites. 6-month prognosis, 6 months or less, that sort of thing. You have to have a physical thing that you're very ill with, at least, if not exactly dying, at least very ill with it. So I was working in that framework, but it doesn't apply to me. But, I wondered to myself, might I consider going to Switzerland the way Faith did? And the thing is, I've arranged my ashes to be scattered off of Point Sur and Big Sur. It's going to be a long trip back, and I don't have a lot of relatives that I can work things out with. I'm not sure how I would get myself back from Switzerland. So I hesitate and pause about that one. Think about it, but I don't know. I just go week to week, day to day, month to month. Singing Baruch Atah Adonai several times a day.
Is it fair to say that you have a vision for a completed life, but that time is not yet here?
No, it's now, but I'd like to choose a date. I mean, now in the sense of I'm ready to choose a date and a circumstance, but I don't know how to do it. I made a serious effort in my time both to live honestly and to leave the world a somewhat better place than it was when I got here. And I've been imperfect along the way while doing that.
Would you say a life well lived?
I think, yes. I think, to my sense of things, it was well lived, yeah.
So as we conclude here, are there any other thoughts or comments you'd like to share with us?
I think the only regret I have about my life is that I wasn't more of an architect in my time. That was the gift that I was sort of born to do. But life got in the way, if you know what I mean. Problems can divert us. Existential questions like, what's it all about? When nobody likes you and you don't fit in and that sort of thing. And I did eventually get to do some architectural work. But my regret would be I wasn't an architect in my time. I like to think I could have done some beautiful work. And the work that I do is work that allows a person to live in the house and appreciate nature outside, appreciate the world outside. So you live in relationship with the creation and ultimately in homage to God and to the creation. I wish I could have done more of that. I'm sorry I didn't do more. I would apologize to God for that, but I kind of got hamstrung with what's it all about kind of stuff for many years, which had its good side as well. I got a good education, had a lot of good experiences while pursuing other things than architecture. Even while, though, pursuing the monastic stuff, I did do one architectural thing. My plans for renovation of the monastic church at that community were realized. I drew up the plans and they were implemented I gave them the plans, and then I was off on my leave of absence, and 2 years later, they implemented them. It's a beautiful church. It's very Buddhist or very Jewish in the sense, no imagery, just space and one or two symbols of the scriptures and the bread and the wine that the Jews have and Christians have and also celebrate. That's kind of all there is, and it's just beautiful space. God is in, it's the non-icon kind of thing. It's not icons and statues and pictures everywhere. It's the absence of that, which makes it very ecumenical. It's Jewish, it's Protestant, it's Islamic. People can feel right there, except for some of these Christians who come in wondering where the pictures of the saints are, all that kind of stuff. They shouldn't worry about it.
Since you're so well read and such a scholar of many different texts in multiple different languages, is there a quote that has always guided you throughout your life, or something that's always resonated with you that comes to mind that you keep, close to you, or that inspires you?
For my whole life, I'm not sure. There's a few that circle around me right now. I have one on the wall here from Willa Cather. The end is nothing. The road is all. Willa Cather in one of her books, meaning, dying is just the period at the end of the sentence. It was what happened in life. That's everything. And there's a Mark Twain thing that says, the fear of death proceeds from the fear of life. Anyone who has lived fully does not fear death. I don't fear death, so I conclude that must mean I've lived fully.
You just heard, dying is the period at the end of the sentence. If you would like to share a response to Fred's story, please feel free to reach out to us on our social media platforms @CompletedLife. We would like to thank Fred for reaching out to us and sharing his story. If you would like to follow in Fred's footsteps and share your story of a completed life on this podcast, whether for yourself or a loved one, please email us at info@completedlife.org. This has been Voices of the Completed Life. Thank you so much for listening. Visit us at www.completedlife.org. That's completedlife.org, where you'll find extensive video content regarding resources on aid in dying, featuring discussions led by expert clinicians, bioethicists, policymakers, and end-of-life doulas. At the Completed Life Initiative, we advocate for a person's right to direct their own end-of-life care. Take control over your transition, your life, your choice.